So thank you. I will try and talk briefly as well about collecting policies and practices at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge. And I went back to the collections development policy, which is something that we are required to do as part of being an accredited museum every 5 years or so, to look at what we'd said in that. And you'll see in the first paragraph it talks about anthropological material of research and aesthetic value, not only artifacts but photographic and related records, the collection of contemporary art that's relevant to the collections and the intellectual challenges, and work that's relevant to but not limited to communities that represent the collections. The museum also has a large collection of European archaeology, and particularly from the region surrounding Cambridge. We have this kind of dual role also as a regional archaeological collection, and there are various mechanisms through which that material is also acquired. And the third kind of large collection or area of the collection is world archaeology, so archaeological material from the rest of the world. And that's actually the collection that I'm responsible for now. And what you'll see in the final paragraph there is obviously because of UNESCO rules and so on post-1970, actually it's very difficult to acquire material in that area. So that is effectively a closed collection in which collecting is not actively happening. But obviously we try to do things to make it relevant. And I'll talk a little bit at the end about some of the ways in which we're thinking about reinterpreting that collection and the ways in which some of the collecting might happen to relate to that. But to talk kind of historically about the collecting, the sorts of collecting that's happened, Nick talked yesterday about his large art fund project to collect works on paper. Some of that work was happening from the early 1990s at MAA, and this is Alec Topoti from the Torres Strait with a print that he made, came into the collection then and is now in the Power of Paper exhibition that Nick talked about. The other major kind of area of collecting is actually in relation to the work of the university. So we have a small endowment called the Crowther Beynon Fund, and through that the museum has been funding mainly kind of doctoral field workers, sometimes master's field workers, who are doing research in different areas of the world to make small collections that are informed by and come out of their kind of research processes. So I've got a series of examples here about some of the collections that have been made over the last kind of 15 or 20 years. Material from Vanuatu. And some of these things, I should say, they were funded primarily to make a collection as part of the research that they were doing in relation to that, often a kind of co-collecting in which people who are involved in the research were informing that. But some of those things led into exhibitions, small exhibitions that happened back at the museum. And so I've got some small catalogues here that relate to some of the ones that I'm showing. This is a particularly interesting exhibition involving Andrew Motu, who was a PhD student in Cambridge and is now director of the National Museum in Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea. And a very interesting project where he was collecting material in the Atmul area, where we have a very large collection from Gregory Bateson made in the 1930s. And again, it developed an exhibition kind of coming out of that, which was, there's a Paired Brothers, a catalogue that comes from that. Work in Northern Europe as well, and that in that case led into the redevelopment of the display case within the museum. So the collecting that's happened kind of fed into a project, and many of those redisplays as a university museum, the collections are partly being made by PhD students, but the redisplay was also a project that involving master's students who were studying for their master's degrees at the museum. And another example there. And we currently have students actually who are doing field work in Papua New Guinea, 2 or 3 students a year, and we will provide them with these small grants to make collections and some support then to do the documentation that's necessary when those collections come back. So finally, just thinking a little bit about, having started off by saying, well, actually the collection that I'm responsible for, we don't make any collections. We have recently put in a Heritage Lottery Fund application to develop a project to redisplay that. We're taking this notion of transforming the earth as a kind of thematic way of linking together material which we have in very different parts of the world. And what we want to do is to look at what we're calling the origins of the Anthropocene, but to look at different materials, which obviously has a long kind of heritage in archaeology. So looking at stone to start with, which is a large part of the collection because of survival, ceramics, metals, but what we want to do also is think about some of the materials that are really transforming the earth at the moment, and I think that's where contemporary and co-collecting is going to come in, because to continue that story, we need to talk about silicates. We've got glass and faience. What we don't have at the moment is many silicon chips, and so I think we need to think about the impacts of those kinds of materials in the world now, but also in plastics, and that obviously poses some challenges in conservation terms and so on. But I think if we want to take this kind of materially focused approach, think about kind of major transformations in human history, then we need to do that with materials that are being used right up to the present. So, thank you.